I've been a fan of Yu-Gi-Oh for the better part of 2 decades, both the card game and the anime. I grew up with the original Yu-Gi-Oh series, also known as Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters, and I've been more or less hooked ever since. There have been times where I thought I was done with the franchise, but you know how that goes. Nobody actually quits Yu-Gi-Oh! We just take long breaks. This saying is typically reserved for players of the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG, but for me, this has always been true of the anime as well. Ever since Kaiba got obliterated in the first episode, I felt a connection to the series that is difficult to explain. Whenever a new sequel or spin-off is announced, I find it impossible to ignore. Curiosity takes hold, and before I know it, I'm watching the first episode of the newest Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime. I never stick with the newer series, but that doesn't stop the cycle from repeating every 3 to 4 years. Yet somehow, this never applied to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Movies. I, of course, saw the Pyramid of Light movie when I was a kid, but there are officially 6 different Yu-Gi-Oh! Movies, and with the exception of Dark Side of Dimensions, I didn't even know of their existence until after I already started making videos for this YouTube channel. And since I still haven't seen most of them, I thought it would be fun to do a deep dive on all of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Movies in chronological order, and then rank them on a tier list. But first, do yourself a favor by subscribing to this YouTube channel. Trust me, you won't be disappointed. Now let's get into the first movie. The very first Yu-Gi-Oh! Movie, simply titled Yu-Gi-Oh!, came out in March 1999. It's still relatively obscure because it came out years before Yu-Gi-Oh! Made its way to the West. And if I'm being honest, it's hardly even a movie. Don't get me wrong, it is an official Yu-Gi-Oh! Movie. There was even a theatrical release, but the purpose of it was to help launch the, at the time, brand new Yu-Gi-Oh! Official card game. You see, prior to the release of this movie, Yu-Gi-Oh! Had focused on gaming in general as opposed to a single game. The 1998 animated series, which adapts the first 3 arcs of the manga, featured a myriad of different games. Everything from Tamagotchi pets to yo-yos, it's a different game at the center of almost every episode. Over time, however, the Duel Monsters card game became more and more prominent, and in Duelist Kingdom, the 4th arc of the manga, it practically became the only game. That's why the more popular Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime that came out in 2000 is called Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters in Japan. We never got the 1998 series or the 1999 movie internationally, so the subtitle wasn't necessary everywhere else. Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards did exist before the movie, but they were vastly different from the OCG and TCG that the franchise now revolves around. That's because they were made by Bandai, and when their license expired, Konami acquired exclusive rights to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Brand. So in order to keep the card game going, they needed to reboot it. This acquisition could also be what led to the animation studio changing from Toei to Gallop. But I digress. Now that we understand why Yu-Gi-Oh! 1999 was made, we can talk about the contents of the movie itself. To start, the main character isn't even Yugi. Although he does play a major role in the story, it's not told from his perspective. Instead, we follow a boy named Shogo, who is a huge fan of the Duel Monsters card game. In fact, his main goal is to be a top duelist. The only problem is Shogo fears the idea of failure so much that he lacks the self-esteem to play at all. So all he does is hang around the card shop opening packs and watching others play. But everything changes when Shogo acquires the legendary Red Eyes Black Dragon. Because its rarity is on par with that of the Blue Eyes White Dragon, it is a highly sought after card. So Kaiba, who is still a villain at this point in the series, decides to hold a tournament where the rules require the loser of a duel to give their best card to the winner. Then he sends an invitation to both Shogo and Yugi, with intent to acquire the Red Eyes card and then defeat Yugi once and for all. But Shogo declines to enter. He may have one of the most powerful cards in the game, but he's still afraid of losing. Kaiba doesn't take no for an answer, so he instructs his henchmen to take Shogo by force. When Yugi finds out how Shogo is being treated, he withdraws from the tournament in solidarity. But this leads to the pair of them getting jumped and Yugi's Millennium Puzzle being stolen. Now Yugi has no choice but to enter the tournament, and in doing so, he has the opportunity to inspire courage in Shogo. And since the movie is only about 30 minutes long, they don't show any of the duels except for one, and then it's over. Now, I know what you're thinking. How does a movie as short as this one get a theatrical release? Well, Yu-Gi-Oh! 1999 was part of a triple feature alongside Digimon Adventure and Dr. Slump during Toei's Spring Anime Fair. For those unfamiliar, Toei's anime festivals are seasonal events designed to capitalize on breaks from school. A few times a year, Toei produces several short films for some of their popular series and then combines them into a single release. So if you buy a ticket to see one of these movies, you're committing to watching all 3 back to back to back. It's a great way to get people from one fan base to cross over into another, but a lot of these movies have aged poorly for the same reason. They're designed with new audiences in mind who are unfamiliar with the series that they're based on. It's not always the case, but Yu-Gi-Oh! 1999 certainly demonstrates the issue. Outside of Shogo, who is completely new, the movie just recycles old ideas. In the 1998 series, Yugi's main rival is Kaiba, and all this movie did was provide us with another duel between the two. It feels more like a pilot episode for the Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters anime, especially when you consider some of the differences between this movie and the 1998 series. If you had already been introduced to Yu-Gi-Oh! Through the series, you would have been a little confused because there are some minor changes that are impossible to ignore. A prime example being the change in Kaiba's hair color. And as I mentioned earlier, they were attempting to promote the Yu-Gi-Oh! OCG. There was only one booster set released before this, but no starter deck or rulebook had been printed until the exact release date of this movie. And despite being the only thing original about Yu-Gi-Oh! 1998, Shogo is the worst part. His inclusion is completely pointless. All he does is whine and complain, and he doesn't even use the Red Eyes card. In fact, he doesn't duel at all. Instead, Yugi takes the Red Eyes from him and uses it for him. I assume Shogo is supposed to represent the audience, but he's already familiar with the game. And this is odd because in the second scene of the movie, Yugi is explaining the game to Joey. Why not use Shogo for the scene if the plot is going to revolve around Shogo not having courage to play? His inclusion makes even less sense when you realize that Tristan, Miho, and Anzu are all in the movie, but only for about 1 minute of combined screen time. It makes no sense. But it's not all bad. As a fan of the series who is looking backwards, I must admit there are some cool moments that make Yu-Gi-Oh! 1999 worth a watch. For example, there's an Easter egg where Rex Raptor is shown losing to Kaiba. This is ironic because that's the character who would introduce us to Red Eyes later on. Unfortunately, I gotta put Yu-Gi-Oh! 1999 in the D tier. I appreciate the history of it, helping launch the Yu-Gi-Oh! OCG, being animated by Toei, but there's not a lot to enjoy about the movie itself, so I'm putting it in D tier. In 2004, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was in a pretty good place. The franchise wasn't quite at peak mania, but it wasn't too far off either. Myself and all of my friends were still very engaged in the hobby, as Invasion of Chaos introduced iconic cards like Chaos Emperor Dragon, and the anime was heating up too as Battle City approached its conclusion. To put it simply, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was primed for another theatrical release. Enter Yu-Gi-Oh! The Movie, Pyramid of Light. Before we go any further, it's important to note that I'll be focusing on the English version of Yu-Gi-Oh! For this part of the video. I usually talk about the Japanese version when making videos, but that's because the English version has a lower quality story. A lot of changes were made in an attempt to appeal to a younger audience when localizing Yu-Gi-Oh! From Japan to America. However, Pyramid of Light is unique in that it was produced and written by 4Kids Entertainment. A Japanese version of the movie came out 3 months after the American release, but for the most part, this movie was made by 4Kids, which is why it released in America first. So that's the version we'll be talking about today. And I did watch both versions just to make sure there weren't any significant differences. There's lots of extra dialogue like when people are reading the effects of a card, but beyond that there's not much to say about it. I also read the manga release, and it's literally just a manga version of the movie. They didn't even bother hiring an artist to draw it. Every panel is just a frame from the movie, cut and pasted into this book. There's also a novel that only came out in Japan, and I actually couldn't find this, so I couldn't read it for myself. But according to the Wikipedia page, the plot is identical except for an added bit about the origin of the Pyramid of Light. Now let's talk about the movie. The plot is pretty straightforward. Immediately following the events of Battle City, Kaiba, who is still determined to defeat Yugi, reaches out to Pegasus in search of a card that can overpower the Egyptian gods. Pegasus tells Kaiba that if a card did exist, he would have to earn it by defeating him in a duel. And he does just that. However, when Kaiba activates this special card during a duel with Yugi, an old rival of the pharaoh named Anubis comes back to life in order to get revenge on the pharaoh for himself. Anubis takes the place of Kaiba in the duel, there's a giant battle, and that's pretty much it. Much to my surprise, I enjoyed this movie quite a bit. Kaiba has some funny moments early on that reminded me just how iconic the 4Kids version of Kaiba really is. I mean, if you haven't seen both versions, the Japanese and the English version of Yu-Gi-Oh!, both are worth a watch just so you can see how different the two characters are, because both are great, but the English version is way better. And I might be a little bit biased because I grew up with this version, but 4Kids Kaiba is just so much more iconic. But I can't ignore all of the problems that this movie has. Mainly, the severe lack of originality. For example, the idea of Kaiba dueling with Pegasus to get stronger cards, it's not a terrible idea. In fact, I like it a lot. Most of the Duel Monsters cards at this point in the series were made by Pegasus, so it makes sense for Kaiba to turn to him of all people. Then there's also the fact that Kaiba never got revenge after losing to Pegasus in Duelist Kingdom. If you recall, Pegasus captured Mokuba, took over Kaiba Corporation, and when Kaiba finally confronted Pegasus, he failed, and even lost his own soul. So it makes a lot of sense to give Kaiba this rematch. The only problem is it already happened. Again, this movie was made by 4Kids and released in America right at the end of the Battle City arc. But Yu-Gi-Oh was already several arcs ahead in Japan, and the arc that follows Battle City, Waking the Dragons, begins almost the exact same way. I've already made a video about Waking the Dragons, so I'll try to keep it brief here. Basically, Pegasus returns and Kaiba has to duel him in order to answer some questions. You could argue that Waking the Dragons is a filler arc, so it doesn't matter, but so is this movie, and it's not like 4Kids refused to dub filler. It's possible that the writers simply didn't know what would happen in Waking the Dragons, but personally, I find that a little hard to believe. Especially since the duel between Pegasus and Kaiba happens very early in the Waking the Dragons arc. It's still cool to see Kaiba versus Pegasus in the movie, it's just cheapened by the fact that they duel again right after when the next arc starts in the anime. Now let's turn our attention to the villain. I feel like this is the worst aspect of the entire film, and unfortunately, it's one of the most important. I wish Anubis had more going for him, but he really has no redeeming qualities, aside from perhaps his name and his voice. Like, how many times is Yugi going to face an old rival of the Pharaohs? Both Bakura and Merrick, two of the three major antagonists from the anime, had very similar backstories. And it doesn't help that Anubis has one of the most uninspired designs I've ever seen. Pyramid of Light is going in the C tier. I did see this movie as a kid, and I grew up with the English version of Yu-Gi-Oh, so there's a little bit of nostalgia bias. But it's a lot better than the Yu-Gi-Oh 1999 movie, and I did find it to be somewhat enjoyable. This next part is going to seem illegitimate because it aired on television as a miniseries, but technically there are two Yu-Gi-Oh! Capsule Monsters movies. I've already made a video about the creation of Yu-Gi-Oh! Capsule Monsters and why it ultimately failed, so I won't rehash everything here. But I do need to explain why I'm including it on this list. So most people don't think of Capsule Monsters as a movie, or a series of movies, because it aired on television as a 12-episode series. But the first half of Capsule Monsters was broadcast on Yugioh.com as a movie months before the first episode of the series aired. Then after the series finished airing, it was released on DVD as two separate movies. Now it's considered a filler arc as part of Season 5 of Duel Monsters, but only in the English version since, like Pyramid of Light, Capsule Monsters was produced by 4Kids. However, unlike the Pyramid of Light, a Japanese version doesn't exist. So again, I'll be talking about the English version because that's the only one that exists. And if you want to know more about Capsule Monsters in general, check out my video about Yu-Gi-Oh! Capsule Monsters. This might be a hot take, but I like the concept behind Capsule Monsters quite a lot. At times it feels like a Pokemon ripoff given the fact that monsters roam freely in the wild until human characters capture them using capsules. Oh, and Capsule Monsters was the original name of Pokemon while it was still in development. But prior to Duelist Kingdom, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was about a master of all games. So in a way, I appreciate the return to form. Now, I know I just criticized Pyramid of Light for being unoriginal, but in Yu-Gi-Oh! Capsule Monsters, the ideas borrowed from Pokemon are only surface level. The plot and even the game have nothing in common with Pokemon. And before there was ever a Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime, the game in the manga was called Magic and Wizards. Sound familiar? Of course it does. That's because Duel Monsters was originally based on Magic the Gathering. Even in the 1999 movie, when they tried to establish the OCG as its own game, you could tell just how influential Magic was in the creation of Duel Monsters. Now, by no means am I saying that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a ripoff. The games are very different in real life. But the same can be said about Yu-Gi-Oh! Capsule Monsters and Pokemon. Once you get past some of the similarities that Capsule Monsters has to Pokemon, Capsule Monsters is actually pretty unique. The villain is Alexander the Great, the real-life historical figure, and that may seem like a random choice to have for a Yu-Gi-Oh! Villain, but Alexander the Great is known for conquering most of the known world. He even became a pharaoh of Egypt, but he died mysteriously at a rather young age. In Capsule Monsters, Yugi meets Alexander the Great when he enters the world of Capsule Monsters. While there, Alexander reveals to Yugi that when he obtained a special trinket in Egypt, he developed a split personality, one that is his normal self and one that is pure evil. He also says that sometime after he acquired the trinket, a mysterious man challenged him to a shadow game, and Alexander lost, with his punishment being that he'd forever be trapped in the world of capsule monsters. I enjoyed the historical fiction element because it's speculating on a real life event, and also it's a callback to Season 0 because the man who challenges Alexander the Great is the same person who challenges Yugi in Season 0. But Capsule Monsters is going in C tier. It had a lot of potential and the plot seems to be way more well thought out than the other Yu-Gi-Oh movies. But the pacing is so bad. I know that Capsule Monsters debuted as a movie, but even the movie versions feel like a television series because they're just so long. And since it was made by 4Kids, it's clearly made for kids. Music never stops playing, the song changes every 5 seconds, and jokes are being told non-stop. I like the voice acting, it's actually good contrary to popular belief, it's just the writing is for kids, so it wasn't very enjoyable for me. And did I mention Kaiba is completely missing from this movie? Capsule Monsters is going in C tier. Now it's time to talk about the first Yu-Gi-Oh movie to feature multiple Yu-Gi-Oh protagonists, Bonds Beyond Time. This movie was created to commemorate the 10th anniversary of Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters in Japan, and since it was created by the Japanese rights holders, we'll be talking about the Japanese version of the movie. That's also important because it takes place after Season 4 of GX, and Season 4 of GX was never dubbed in English. The story begins when Yusei is approached by a masked duelist. Yusei thinks he's being challenged to a duel, so he begins activating cards. But as soon as he brings out his ace monster, Stardust Dragon, the masked duelist absorbs the card into one of his own and runs away. Shortly thereafter, Yusei spots his card in a newspaper detailing a battle that never took place. Suddenly, Neo Domino City begins disappearing, and this is when Yusei realizes that somebody is traveling through time to change the course of history. Yusei uses his D-Wheel to travel back in time to the location of the duel from the article. There he finds Judai in a battle with the masked duelist. But just as he arrives, the masked duelist steals Elemental Hero Neos from Judai and runs away again. Yusei and Judai agree to team up to get their cards back, but then they find another article detailing an event that never happened. Suddenly, the city they're in now begins disappearing as well. The pair have no choice but to travel in time to the event from the article that they just discovered, and there they meet Yugi. Judai and Yusei explain the situation to Yugi, and they all agree to team up to take down the masked duelist, get their cards back, and restore the timeline of Duel Monsters history. Now, I'd like the premise for this movie a lot. If you've seen 5Ds, then you would already know Yusei was capable of time travel, so it's not a random thing that they added just for this movie, and it makes sense of the fact that Yusei is at the center of the story. The concept for the villain is really interesting as well. He's from a dystopian future where the world lies in ruins, and he's been traveling through time to pinpoint the best way to prevent Armageddon. And in his travels, he came to the realization that Duel Monsters cards were the root cause, and in order to save the world, he must erase the game from history. Now, erasing a card game might not seem like a big deal, especially in the grand scheme of things, but the cards have a much bigger impact on history than anticipated, and if you know Yu-Gi-Oh, of course this makes sense. But if you think about it, this is the first time a villain was not concerned with any of the main characters in particular. And in a way, he's not even a villain. The masked duelist, named Paradox, is just as much of a hero as he is a villain, which makes the name Paradox quite fitting. Unfortunately, this is where my praises come to an end. The biggest issue with this movie has got to be the length. It's only 50 minutes long and 31 of those minutes are spent on a single duel. I know that it's Yu-Gi-Oh! And Yu-Gi-Oh! Is all about dueling, and it's a 3-on-1 duel, so it kind of makes sense that it's a lot longer than normal. But I wish they spent more time on setting up the 3 protagonists as a team, and the villain as, well, a villain. Paradox is set up to be some kind of anti-hero, and I like that concept because it presents a unique obstacle for the heroes to overcome. Paradox is making sacrifices in order to save the future. This is very similar to the plot of an early arc in Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds, only Yusei is put in the opposite role this time. One would think that Paradox's mission will resonate with Yusei and create some type of internal conflict. But no, nothing like that happens at all. When Paradox reveals his plans, the protagonists challenge him to a duel, of course they win, and that's the end of Paradox. All things considered, I can't help but feel that this movie was planned to be much longer, because so much of the setup is really good, but they spend way too much time on a duel. It's as if they cut out a lot of content either from the story or the movie itself in order to shrink it down to 50 minutes. And of course, they're going to make the duel as long as possible because they want to show off as many cards as possible, because at the end of the day, all of these Yu-Gi-Oh movies and spin-offs serve to promote the real-life Yu-Gi-Oh card game. But that's really hard to do for a crossover that's supposed to unite 3 different characters from different series. Bonds Beyond Time is going in the B tier. It certainly had a lot of potential, but what good is potential when it's never fully realized? It's still better than the other movies by a lot, but it leaves a lot to be desired. Before we get to the final film, I'd like to tell you about the one that was cancelled. In Volume 8 of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Bunkoban, a reprint of the original manga with slight alterations, Kazuki Takahashi wrote about Yu-Gi-Oh! vs. GX. When the first season of Yu-Gi-Oh! GX ended in 2005, Takahashi thought it would be fun to pit the 2 main characters of Yu-Gi-Oh!, Yugi and Judai, against one another. Takahashi claims that his inspiration for the idea stems from the disappointment he felt when watching Mazinger Z vs. Devilman as a child. Now, I've actually seen this movie and I didn't think it was that bad. But ultimately, the project was cancelled for 2 reasons. The first is that bringing back the Pharaoh would betray the original story. Spoiler alert for those who haven't seen the ending of Duel Monsters or read the manga, Yugi and the Pharaoh go their separate ways at the end of the series. To bring him back after 1 year off would certainly undercut the message of his story. The second reason is that both characters are good guys. Judai is the hero of GX, and Yugi is a hero to Judai. Aside from the name and the premise, nothing is really known about the movie, but it's speculated that the ideas were later worked into the Yu-Gi-Oh! GX anime. Coincidentally, my last video was about Season 2 of GX, and one of the things that stood out to me was the way certain characters were misunderstood and mistaken for villains when they're not necessarily bad at all. And there's also a section of the season that takes place in Domino City rather than Duel Academy Island. Within the context of the arc, it feels completely random. But now that I know about Yu-Gi-Oh! vs. GX, it's starting to make a lot of sense. There's a third reason as well, but I don't want to spoil GX before I cover Season 3. Let's just say some of the issues with Yu-Gi-Oh! vs. GX were resolved by the time GX concluded. And of course, Bonds Beyond Time depicted Judai and the Pharaoh as teammates, so we did end up getting a crossover movie anyway. The time has finally come to talk about Yu-Gi-Oh! Dark Side of Dimensions. This movie is special because it's the only Yu-Gi-Oh! Movie that was written by the creator of Yu-Gi-Oh!, Kazuki Takahashi. As such, it's also unique in that it continues from the manga story rather than the anime story. And there are a ton of differences between the Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga and the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime, too many to get into right now. However, there is one that I'll need to explain in a bit. There's also a prequel manga called Transcend Game that was published shortly before Dark Side of Dimensions came out, and it was billed as a bridge between the manga's ending and the beginning of Dark Side of Dimensions, although it contributes practically nothing to the movie. And I'm not saying you shouldn't read it, but all the crucial bits happen in the movie anyway, so you definitely don't need to read it. Now let's talk about the plot of the movie. Dark Side of Dimensions takes place 6 months after the end of the manga. Yugi and his friends are about to graduate from high school and basically move on with their lives, but Kaiba is still obsessing over his losses to the Pharaoh, so much so that he violates the tomb of the Pharaoh in order to dig up the Millennium Puzzle. Then once he reconstructs it, his plan is to force Yugi to call back the Pharaoh and attempt to defeat him once and for all in front of the entire world. This is where the manga continuity becomes important. At the end of the anime, when Yugi defeated the Pharaoh in a duel, Kaiba referred to Yugi as the true king of games. In the manga, Kaiba never even saw this duel take place, so he never could have said any of that. Obviously, if he did, then the entire premise of this movie would make no sense. Although, early in the movie, Kaiba does retell the events of the ending, so he clearly knows what happened. I guess you could argue that the manga differences don't matter too much, but Kaiba never acknowledged Yugi as being better than the Pharaoh, so he probably doesn't believe the story even if he's been told by someone what actually happened. Anyway, Kaiba digs up the Millennium Puzzle, puts most of the pieces back together, and then duels with Yugi to earn the last one. Dark Side of Dimensions is going in the B tier. Now, hear me out. Before I get into any of the issues, and there are some big ones, let's talk about the positives. For starters, Dark Side of Dimensions is the only Yu-Gi-Oh! Movie that looks and feels like a movie. Rather than a long commercial for the TCG or OCG, it has a real cinematic feel. The animation in this movie is top-notch, far superior to that of the others, and it's 2 hours long. Finally, a feature-length Yu-Gi-Oh! Film. And get this, even dub watchers will be able to enjoy the Japanese soundtrack, which remixes a bunch of classic songs from the Japanese anime soundtrack. I won't play any of them in this video, for obvious reasons, so look it up if you're curious. And aside from the anime and manga continuity difference, the premise for this movie is very strong. I know it's another movie about Kaiba trying to get a win over the Pharaoh, but the execution here is really something to behold. If Kaiba was never there when Yugi beat the Pharaoh, of course he's not going to just take his word for it. He often denies the possibility of things as they happen right in front of him, so I can get behind this premise for one last movie. Also, this movie is told from Kaiba's perspective more so than Yugi's. Both get plenty of screen time, but Dark Side of Dimensions is very much a Kaiba story. There is a massive subplot about Aigami and the interdimensional travelers, but none of those parts make any sense. And this isn't necessarily an issue, even though I dislike changes between dubs, but the English version is way better. If I hadn't seen both versions of the movie, then I would assume the English dub is a complete no-go. The movie continues from the manga version of Yu-Gi-Oh, which already has its share of differences from the Japanese version of the anime. And of course, 4Kids removed a lot of key story elements when dubbing it, so it's differences on top of differences. However, the changes made by 4Kids improve the experience quite a lot. For example, the premise of this movie works way better with the 4Kids version of Kaiba. I touched on this in my Pyramid of Light review, but if you're unfamiliar with both versions of the character, Kaiba is more egotistical in the dub. He has tons of pride in the Japanese version too, but he takes it up a notch, adding to his personality. So the premise works better with 4Kids Kaiba. I know that was a bit of a minor change, but 4Kids also made changes to the plot that clearly and obviously improved the original story. There is a secret group of interdimensional travelers in this movie called the Plana, and the leader, Aigami, is always spewing some nonsense about frequencies and wavelengths. 4Kids did a great job of simplifying this so the viewer doesn't get caught up trying to understand something that adds nothing to the plot to begin with. And that brings me to the biggest problem with the movie, the ending. When Kaiba duels with Yugi for the last piece of the puzzle, their duel is interrupted, because of course it is, but Yugi finishes the puzzle anyway to demonstrate that the Pharaoh is gone for good. One would think that this, coupled with the fact that Yugi nearly beat Kaiba, would prove that the real contender is Yugi. But no, instead, Aigami emerges as a monster, Yugi and Kaiba are forced to team up, they lose anyway, and then the Pharaoh saves the day. What? Talk about undercutting the original story. This isn't just bad, it's the worst possible ending they could have had. The entire movie builds the final battle as one that will finally teach Kaiba that his obsession is holding him back. And also that Yugi's win over the Pharaoh was not a fluke, meaning he doesn't need the Pharaoh anymore. But instead, they bring back the Pharaoh to save the day again? I know I said it feels like a Kaiba story, but this is going too far. Kaiba doesn't even get to duel with the Pharaoh, and at the end, Kaiba dies as a result of his obsession. I mean, technically he does duel with the Tem, but Kaiba has to travel to the afterlife in order to do it. In the final scene, Kaiba tells an emotional Mokuba, "The rest is up to you," suggesting that he'll never be back. And if that's not convincing, in Transcend Game, the prequel manga that I mentioned earlier in this video, Kaiba is told by one of the Plana that if he goes to the realm of the afterlife, where the Pharaoh resides, he will be trapped there forever, meaning he'll die. The ending alone has me tempted to lower this movie to D tier, but all things considered, it's not much worse than Bonds Beyond Time, so I'll keep it at B tier. It's odd to me that the only other Yu-Gi-Oh movie that Takahashi was going to write got cancelled, because according to his own words, it would undercut the ending of Yu-Gi-Oh's manga. I guess he stopped caring somewhere along the way. But hold on, before we wrap this up, there's an alternate ending that you need to know about. Kazuki Takahashi must have been unsatisfied with the ending after all, because shortly after the film released, he published an illustration on his Instagram account with the following caption: 4 years have passed. Yugi, as expected, wins at the World Game Contest and begins walking the achieved dream path of a game creator. Yugi's game is given a high valuation, so what ends up happening is Kaiba Corporation embarking on joint development. Yugi's invented sphere-faceted model fighting game, Spherium 2, prototype model is complete. So right now, Kaiba and Yugi commence the fight on the stage of space. From now on, Yugi Muto becomes the new Game King. This is just one possible future story. Thanks for cheering on the Yu-Gi-Oh movie this year. It's great to have drawn an illustration on what Yugi's prospective future felt like together with Kaiba. I love this ending, and I wonder why it wasn't used instead of what we got. Maybe Takahashi didn't have as much creative control as was let on, and he had to revive the Pharaoh in the end, but we'll never know. And if I'm not mistaken, this is the first time that Yugi and Kaiba are depicted facing off in a game other than Duel Monsters cards. Really cool to see that Duel Monsters is not the only game in the future. But those are just my thoughts. Let me know how you would rank the Yu-Gi-Oh movies. Subscribe for more Yu-Gi-Oh videos, and thanks for watching.